thank you for taking the time to let me tell you about what happened to my dad and the awful time that we've been through as a family. Don't get me wrong, my dad was 84 years old and we fully understand that old age can take its toll. But the last few weeks of his life were just so painful to watch. He'd been keeping well. He was mobile at home around his bungalow, and he used to enjoy sitting outside in his back garden. He used to say, as long as I can keep my legs moving, I'll be fine. And he did. He could manage. We helped him with his meals and cleaning. It all started when his right arm became swollen. It was really hard and hot to touch. The GP came out to see him at home and said that Dad had got something called cellulitis. It's an infection of the skin and tissue, and said that Dad needed antibiotics straight into the vein. So he was going to arrange for Dad to be admitted to hospital. Well, Dad had never been in hospital before, and with what you read in the newspapers, we were a little bit worried about how well he'd be looked after. Well, at visiting time, it was always very clear when the ward sister was on duty, because when she wasn't there, all the nurses' call bells were ringing. The nurses were stood around the desks chatting. But when she was there, all the nurses were in the patient's bays asking questions like, is there anything you need, Mr. Smith? A totally different feel to the place. Anyway, it was at visiting I noticed that Dad had not got out of bed when we'd been there. So I asked one of the nurses if he was mobile and walking around the wards okay, because he had been before he came in. He'd been perfectly mobile. And she said to me, there is no reason why Mr. Smith cannot walk. He just needs a little encouragement. It was like they were saying he lacked willpower or something, which wasn't the case. He was always a very determined man. At visiting, the ward sister said they were going to discharge my dad. His arm was better and that was good. So I asked about his mobility and if he'd been walking around, because we hadn't seen him get out of bed yet. And the ward sister said, yeah, there was no reason why he shouldn't be mobile and he just needed some encouragement. It just didn't ring true. I said he was a very determined man. It was like they were telling me Dad had given up. I did try telling them, but it was like they weren't listening. So Dad was discharged home, and it was clear very quickly that he was just too physically weak to be able to get out of bed himself, even to go to the toilet. Things just got worse and worse then, and his legs started swelling, which made walking even harder. Well, we had to take Dad back into hospital. An overwhelming infection is what the doctor in A&E said. Dad had something called sepsis. It's serious, especially in the elderly. And Dad died that night. I knew all this talk about him not being bothered to get out of bed wasn't true. He was ill, and I knew he was ill. I just didn't realise how ill.